Welcome to the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program's Ottoman Greeks of the United States Digital History Project's Remembering 1922 video series. In this and all upcoming episodes of the series, the names of the interviewees have been coded to protect their identity. Like in previous episodes, migration from the islands in the Sea of Marmara included experiences of economic migration, escape from conscription, and forced displacement and expulsion. Descendants of Ottoman Greek migrants describe their settlement in Athens, Evia, and Thessaloniki. These locations in Greece also served as places of onward migration to Charleston, New York, Los Angeles, Pittsburgh, Portland, and Seattle. Nick, Tina, Tim, Mary, and Lisa's recollections speak to these diverse experiences. Nick's father left the island of Marmara for Istanbul and jumped ship in the U.S.
My father left the island as a young kid. He wasn't very educable. So he got like a third grade education. And I think by the time he was 13 or 14, I don't have the dates exact, he left with friends of his. They went to Istanbul. They were working in Istanbul for quite a while. And then somewhere in the 20s, he wound up getting a job. He has an uncle, and his name may have come up somewhere along the way. So he was a fairly wealthy ship owner who married into my father's family. So he was an uncle to my father. He gave him a job on one of his ships. So Pop went to the seas for probably 10 or 12 years, and these are dates I don't have right. So somewhere along the way, he winds up in Newport News on his uncle's boat, and he worked on the bridge. He had a pretty good job with them. And he got into a fight with the captain. So he jumped ship at Newport News. I don't know what, he had nothing in his pocket. He barely managed to get to New York, where he had some addresses. So he came here basically illegally.
Tina's father left the island of Marmara for economic reasons. He also jumped ship and migrated to Los Angeles.
He left in 1901, and I think it was economic reasons. And he went to Istanbul and stowed away, or became part of the crew. He was stoking the boilers on the ship, and he came to New York that way. We think he jumped ship because we can't find any immigration papers or anything from Ellis Island or even Boston. And then first thing he did was go to the Seamen's Center, where they find jobs for people who know anything about the sea. So that's always his introduction to the United States.
Tim recalled his grandfather's escape from conscription to the Ottoman army, and his grandmother's escape from the island of Marmara.
My grandfather, Nikoli, had left because he didn't want to be inducted into the Turkish army. And he was in Alexandria, Egypt. He went to Alexandria. And Grandma was trying to get out of Turkey. And so she was resourceful. She would be selling her jewelry, whatever she had, just so they could eat to get out. And all their birth certificates or baptismal papers or whatever they had, they gave them to the Proctor, and that guy sold them to someone else so they could get out. So I don't know, and so they ended up stealing, or not them themselves, but them taking someone else's documents so they could get out of the country. And my mother said that they loaded them up on like cattle wagons. And probably Constantinople, I'm guessing, I don't know. And the Turks were mean, and they would throw rocks at them, the kids. They would throw rocks, but she said we were lucky. We had a tarp over the top of our... And then she told me another story that this one little Turkish girl felt sorry for them, and she gave my mother a hard-boiled egg to eat.
Mary describes her mother experiencing 2 expulsions from Enkilnik and her mother's settlement in Greece by the Refugee Resettlement Commission.
When they left the first time, they ended up in Istanbul. And she just remembers, it was chaotic and everybody was rushing to gather their belongings. And they ended up in Istanbul. I'm not sure how long they were there. And it was a temporary thing, they told me. They gave them no reason, but they went back. And they slowly, went back to their homes and continued their life. And they thought that was the end of it. As far as, they would end up staying there, but it didn't happen. And then about 6 years later, well, at that point they were burning the homes, the churches, she says. At that point they were just running for their lives. It was like running to get on the boats to escape. That's all. I mean, she remembers a little bit of that. It's very, like I said, she was still, she was what, how old then? She was maybe 12 years old. So she just remembers the traumatic experience. I think she blocked a lot of that stuff out of her mind at that point. But she remembers the fires, the screaming, it was just a bad situation. And then when they had to leave again, the government gave them a choice to settle the Kutayenid, the choice either in Vulyagmeni or to settle in Limnos. And they chose Limnos because they were sponge divers by trade. From Kutali, they were sponge divers. They wanted to be closer to the water. They wanted more of an island setting is what they wanted. And they basically gave them starter homes over there. She didn't have her own home, but so she stayed with her cousin. She had like it was like a one bedroom, no bathroom, was an outhouse. But my grandmother didn't live very long there. She got married in 1928 in Limnos with her husband, with my Abu, 1928. And then from there, they went to Thessaloniki to meet the rest of the family. They stayed in Calamaria. And then from there, they came to Charleston, South Carolina.
Many of the descendants from the islands in the Sea of Marmara describe their ancestors experiencing expulsions from their homes and tragic and deadly conditions in internment camps near Bursa. Nikki's mother had such experiences.
All I remember my aunt telling me was that they were told to leave and that they collected whatever they could. They sewed stuff into their brackets, which I thought was an interesting word. And my grandfather was able to rent a kaiki, a boat, and they went there to Brusa, I believe, somewhere around Brusa. That's the word. That's the name that I recall. I don't really know anything more than that, except that they, while they were there, my aunt. There was just my aunt and her younger sister and my mother, the 3 girls, and 2 of the younger boys. My older uncles were already gone. My oldest uncle, my grandfather paid the Turkish government to keep him out of the army, so he was still in Turkey. And in fact, he was already married. He was that much older than my mother. The other 2, because my grandfather was afraid that they were going to take them into the army, sent them to America. So they were already over here. The 2 younger ones were like 14 and maybe 10. While they were there in Brusa, I assume that's where they were, wherever they were in the camp, and after my grandparents died, the Turkish army came in and took the older one and took him into the Turkish army. And although they tried very hard to find, never heard of him again. It's gone, just gone. So
And so they were there probably a year, maybe a year and a half, before they were allowed to come back to Marmara. And like I said, by that time, of course, the parents were dead. And it was a mess when they came back, because the Turkish army had billeted soldiers on the island, of course, and they had burned the olive trees, and it was a mess. But at that point, my oldest uncle came back. He was in Istanbul when this all happened, so he was okay. And when he came back, he had some money, and he tried to redo the business on the island, but then, of course, they were all told that they had to leave again when they did the LAE. Yeah. So my mother went to live with him. My oldest aunt, this must have been 1920, she came to America and got married. That was the wedding picture that you saw. But my mother and her older sister went to live with their oldest brother, who was married and had kids that my mother babysat for him, you know.
Ben recalls a particular reason that he believes led to his family's expulsion from the island of Marmara, and also the forced displacement of all its Ottoman Greek inhabitants.
They talk about the two exarchias. The first exodus was very sudden, and it was when the Battle of Gallipoli started, and told me in detail, actually, of the British ship that was the flagship of the fleet came into Othoni, because Othoni faces the Kanikali Peninsula. You can see it at night, it lights up. And when the HMS Elizabeth came in, they outfitted the ships. They gave them food and supplies. And one Theo raised a Union Jack, and they had to dress him as a woman and smuggle him off the island because the Turks found out. And after that, they came and evacuated the whole island for fear that it would side with the British efforts, and were taken in 1950. And Yaya, I don't know if she told me the name of the camps they were taken to, but she described them in great detail and described the Armenians and Pontians that were in the same camp in that time. And she said that their hearts were broken because they were separated afterwards. And although they weren't told what happened to them, they knew what was going to happen to them. And then they were brought back in 1918, and from 1918 to the Treaty of Lausanne, they remained on the island, and my papa was still in America, so it was very difficult for them. He is running the business here. The cousin that was operating his ship would routinely give them money to live on, but they were pretty well on their own, and it was very difficult for her. And so in 1923, they were taken off to Asia Minor again before the population exchange. And between the two exodus to the Anatolia, half the island didn't return, and so half of the relatives were lost. There were 15,000 taken over, less than 7,000 were returned. They don't know how many died, how many escaped, how many may have Turkified during that time, but half never made it back. And then on the second time is when my mother wasn't on the island at that time. At age 11, she was in Constantinople with the other aunt, and my papu found out about the population exchange and went back. And we don't know how long. We thought it took him about a month to get there, according to Yaya, a week traveling by train and then by ship. And he found the camp paid off whoever he needed to pay off, took them, got my mother from Constantinople and some other relatives and brought them here. The ship that followed them in 23 was denied passage by American authorities.
George's paternal grandparents were also displaced from the island of Marmara and held in an internment camp.
Well, between 1915 and 1918, my papu's parents were put in an internment camp by the Turks, and they died there. So, you know, my papu never spoke about it. He had a younger sister who was 14, and she also died in that internment camp. And then my yaya, her parents died in 1922 when they had the big population exchange, as the Greeks would call it, the catastrophe. So both of them, even though they were older, they were adults. They both had lost their parents and were orphans, and they never spoke about it. They just didn't speak about it.
Finally, Rita's mother suffered a tragic forced displacement from the island of Imrali.
My mother actually grew up in an orphanage. She was part of the Yiorgo, you know, where they deported them. They were told not to even bring anything with them, that they were just to, you know, go with the clothes that they were wearing and just get in line and go. In other words, it was really a very abrupt kind of deportation. They didn't have time. When they deported them, they were deported to the area of Brusa. And what she said was that they were given the quarters that the Armenians had vacated because they were forced out by the Turks before them. So it was there, and that they were settled in that as refugees, basically, in these hovels. And I guess at some point, her mother contracted cholera and her father contracted dysentery, and they died 6 months apart of each other. And then the children were left alone, and the oldest was 9 years old. My mother was next, and then she has her brother, and there was one more who died of the baby that was only 6 months old, I believe. My cousin, whose mother was my mother's sister, the oldest one, she would go, when her mother died of cholera, they threw the bodies in a pit and put lime on them. And she would go there and cry and ask her mother to come back. My mother, at one point, was captured by a Turkish family, and they wanted to basically make her, you know, convert to Islam. And my aunt had lost track of her. She must have been in the streets or something. I don't know where they captured her. And she was looking for her and found her finally in the neighborhood there, and saw that they had a Hoja who was praying over her. And they had her dressed in white and all this other stuff. And they were praying over her to make her Muslim. And so my aunt waited around to find an opportunity to grab her, which she did eventually, and took her away. And I guess they somehow got away from them. And the next thing my mother told me was that not too long after that, my mother's aunt, her mother's sister, found them. I guess she must have been looking for them or what have you, I don't know. And she found them, took all the children and took them to Constantinople. And then the Patriarchio kind of took care of the orphans, and that's when my mother was sent to Khalki. My mother said that she went to the Emborikiscoli. It was an Emborikiscoli before they made it into an orphanage. It was called the Emborikiscoli Business School, and but they converted it to an orphanage. And her memory of the orphanage was very positive. She said they were well brought up, When she was supposed to be adopted by Kyria Skilitsi, who was, according to her, was Venizelo's niece, the day she was supposed to be adopted, they were bathing her, and they have to boil the water. Back then they had to, boil it and so forth. Well, somehow the water, the kettle or something, burned her arm. So when Kyria Skilitsi showed up to pick up my mother, they told her to come back another time and wait until her arm healed and so forth. And Kyria Skilitsi, I guess, agreed. And between that experience and her coming back, my aunt intervened when she found out with this other person who found them, their aunt, her name was Vasiliki. So Vasiliki and my mother's sister, who was staying with Vasiliki now in Constantinople, they came. Somehow they either got wind of it or whatever, I don't know. They came and they took her out. And then my mother went to work for an English family as kind of a nanny. And she went to Constantinople, and she worked for an English professor or teacher who was at Roberts College. And she remembers being on a boat with him and the family and watching the children, and one of the children ended up in the water in the Bosporus or someplace where they had a boat, and my mother dove in and saved the child because she had good skills in swimming and so forth. So she saved their child. Eventually her older sister, the one that took care of all of them, got married in Turkey, in Constantinople, had her first child, and then they were part of the exodus to Thessaloniki, and my mother was part of the exchange, and so she joined her sister in Thessaloniki, where they put all the refugees, in the houses there. When she went to Thessaloniki, she was around 18 years old, or 18 years old. And she got married about a year later and then came to the United States.
This month's focus on the immigrants and refugees from the islands in the Sea of Marmara shed light on journeys and experiences not seen in previous episodes. Because of the politics related to the Sea of Marmara in the early 20th century, descendants retold stories of displacement, return, and expulsion that were not common in previous episodes. In our upcoming episodes, regarding immigrants and refugees from Bozcaada, Gökçeada, and the western coast of Asia Minor, such experiences will reemerge. The researchers at the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program's Ottoman Greeks of the United States Digital History Project would like to thank you, our listeners, for your support of this important research. We look forward to your comments and hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed producing it. See you next time.